The sun shone bright over the royal palace. Hundreds of people stood in line to see the famous changing of the guards. Among them was Walter Jenkins, a 78-year-old man with white hair and kind eyes. Walter had been a history teacher for 40 years. Now that he was retired, he could finally visit the places he had taught about for so long. Walter stood near the front of the crowd. He wore his best suit and held a wooden cane. His heart beat fast with joy. After saving money for 5 years, he was finally here, at the palace he had only seen in books. "It's even more beautiful than the pictures," Walter said to himself. He took out his old camera to take a photo. The crowd grew bigger as the time for the guard change came near. People pushed closer to the gates, trying to get a better view. Walter felt people pressing against him from behind, but he kept his spot. He had waited too long for this moment. Not far behind Walter stood a man named Derek. Derek was tall and strong, with a shaved head and angry eyes. He wore a black leather jacket with ripped jeans. A long scar ran down his left cheek. People moved away when they saw him coming. Derek had not come to see the palace or the guards. He was there to pick pockets in the crowd. But today, things were not going well for him. The tourists were keeping their bags too close, and security cameras watched every corner. Derek's mood got worse when he saw how slowly the line was moving. He started pushing people out of his way. When they complained, he gave them a hard look that made them quiet. No one wanted trouble with a man who looked so mean. "Move!" Derek shouted at a young mother with a baby. She quickly stepped aside, fear in her eyes. At the palace gates, 6 guards stood perfectly still. They wore bright red uniforms with tall black hats. Their faces showed no emotion as they stared straight ahead. These guards were famous for never smiling, never talking, and never moving from their spots unless ordered to. One of these guards was James Wilson. At 25 years old, he was the youngest guard at the palace. James had been a soldier before becoming a palace guard. He had fought in wars and saved many lives. Now his job was to stand still and protect the palace. James saw the crowd from where he stood. He noticed Walter, the old man with the cane, smiling with excitement. James also noticed Derek pushing his way through the crowd. Something about the man made James feel uneasy. The head guard had told James many times, "Never leave your post. Never break formation. No matter what happens, unless there is a direct attack on the palace or the royal family, you stay where you are." James took his job very seriously. In 3 years as a palace guard, he had never broken a rule. Even when tourists made funny faces or when birds landed on his hat, James stayed perfectly still. The palace clock struck 10. The ceremony was about to begin. Trumpets started to play, and the crowd cheered. Walter's eyes filled with tears of joy. Derek's eyes narrowed as he spotted an easy target, an old man too busy looking at the palace to protect his wallet. Little did anyone know that in the next few minutes, something would happen that would change many lives forever. The peaceful morning at the palace gates was about to turn into a moment of danger, courage, and unexpected heroism. The royal band played louder as the ceremony began. Soldiers marched in perfect lines toward the palace gates. Their boots hit the ground in the same beat. The crowd watched with wide eyes. Walter stood on his tiptoes to see better. His old legs shook a bit, but he didn't care. He had waited his whole life for this moment. As a history teacher, he had told hundreds of students about this ceremony. Now he was finally seeing it himself. "Look at those uniforms," Walter whispered, "just like in the books." Derek moved closer to Walter. He wasn't watching the ceremony. His eyes were on Walter's back pocket, where the old man's wallet made a small bump. Derek had stolen many wallets before. He knew how to do it without people noticing. Derek came right behind Walter. He pretended to watch the ceremony, while his hand slowly reached for Walter's pocket. Just then, Walter moved to the side to take a picture. Derek missed the wallet and felt angry. Stupid old man, Derek thought. His day was getting worse, and his temper was rising. At his post, James Wilson stood like a statue. His red uniform was perfect, not a wrinkle in sight. His black boots shined in the sun. James had trained for months to stand this still. His legs hurt and his back was stiff, but his face showed nothing. James could see what was happening in the crowd without moving his eyes. He saw Walter taking pictures with shaky hands. He saw Derek moving closer to the old man. James had been a soldier long enough to know when someone was up to no good. He looks like trouble. James thought about Derek, but there was nothing he could do. Palace guards never left their posts during the ceremony, unless there was a real danger. The head guard, Captain Harris, stood nearby. He was a strict man who followed every rule. He had sent guards home for less than leaving their post. Captain Harris had told James many times, "We are not police. We protect the palace, not the tourists." The ceremony continued. The marching soldiers came closer to the gates. This was the moment everyone was waiting for, when the new guards would replace the old ones. Walter raised his camera higher to get a better picture. Derek tried again to reach Walter's wallet. This time, his fingers touched it. But a woman in the crowd bumped into Derek, making him miss again. Derek's face turned red with anger. In the palace, the royal family watched from a window. The queen, dressed in blue, nodded at the perfect performance of her guards. She had seen this ceremony thousands of times, but she still found it beautiful. Back in the crowd, a group of school children pointed at the guards. "They never move," one boy said. "I heard they don't even blink." Another child added. Their teacher smiled. "They are trained to be still, but they're still human." The children giggled and waved at James, trying to make him smile. James saw them, but kept his face serious. Inside, he wanted to smile back. He had joined the palace guards to protect people, especially children. Before becoming a guard, James had rescued children from a burning building during his time as a soldier. He had won medals for his bravery. Derek gave up on stealing the wallet. He was too angry now. People kept getting in his way. The crowd pressed closer as the ceremony reached its most important part. Derek felt trapped and hot in his leather jacket. His bad mood was turning into rage. Walter didn't notice anything. His eyes were on the palace, the guards, and the ceremony. This was the happiest day of his life since his wife, Mary, had died 5 years ago. She had always wanted to visit the palace with him. "I wish you could see this, Mary," Walter thought, his heart full of both joy and sadness. No one knew that in just a few minutes, this beautiful ceremony would be interrupted by an act of violence, and an even more surprising act of heroism. The ceremony reached its middle point. The royal band played a famous march. Tourists took hundreds of pictures. Walter's face showed pure joy as he watched soldiers in bright uniforms parade past the gates. Derek's mood got worse with each passing minute. The sun was hot. The crowd was too tight, and his plans to steal wallets had failed. He wiped sweat from his forehead and looked for a way out of the crowd. "Too many people," Derek mumbled. He tried to push back, but more tourists had filled the space behind him. He was stuck near Walter, the old man who kept moving around to take pictures. Walter didn't notice Derek's angry looks. He was busy trying to stand steady on his old legs while holding his camera. The cane helped, but standing for so long was hard at his age. Still, Walter wouldn't miss a second of the ceremony. "Excuse me," Walter said politely as he moved slightly to avoid bumping into a young woman next to him. His good manners were part of who he was, a kind teacher who had helped thousands of students during his long career. Derek didn't share Walter's politeness. When someone stepped on his foot by accident, Derek pushed the person hard. "Watch it," Derek growled. The tourist, a young man from another country, quickly moved away with a scared look. At his post, James Wilson kept his eyes facing forward, but he could see the trouble brewing in the crowd. He had been trained to notice dangers while seeming not to look. James saw Derek's angry face and the way he pushed people. He saw Walter's shaky legs and how the old man sometimes struggled to keep his balance. That old man should be more careful, James thought, and that angry guy needs to calm down. But there was nothing James could do while on duty. The rules were clear. Palace guards did not leave their posts during ceremonies unless there was a direct threat to the palace or royal family. Tourists had to take care of themselves, or the regular police would help if needed. These rules had been the same for hundreds of years. James knew the story of a guard from 1890 who had stayed at his post even when a horse ran wild in a crowd. That guard had been praised for his discipline. Captain Harris walked behind a line of guards, checking that each one stood perfectly. When he passed James, he gave a small nod of approval. James was one of his best guards, young but serious about the job. In the crowd, Walter took a small step forward as the ceremony reached an important part. The old guards were about to hand over their duties to the new guards. This was what Walter had come to see. "Wonderful," Walter whispered as he raised his camera again. This small movement pushed Walter slightly into Derek's face. It wasn't much, just a small step back as Walter tried to balance himself. But for Derek, who was already angry and hot, it was too much. "That's it," Derek said through clenched teeth. His hands formed into fists. A woman standing nearby noticed Derek's angry face. She saw how he was looking at the old man. She started to say something to warn Walter, but her words were lost in the sound of the royal band. At that moment, the drums beat louder. The crowd pushed forward to see better. Walter, trying to keep his balance, stepped back again, right onto Derek's foot. "I'm sorry," Walter began to say, turning slightly, but he never finished his sentence. Derek's rage exploded. All his anger from the failed day, the hot sun, the crowded space, all of it focused on this old man who kept getting in his way. "Get out of my way, old man," Derek shouted. And then he did something terrible. With both hands, Derek pushed Walter hard in the back. Walter, weak on his feet and not expecting the push, fell forward. His cane flew from his hand. His arms waved in the air as he tried to catch himself. But it was too late. The old man was falling straight toward the hard stone path in front of the palace gates. People gasped. A woman screamed. Time seemed to slow down as Walter fell. His head was about to hit the stone, a hit that could kill someone his age. And James Wilson, the young palace guard who had never broken a rule in 3 years of service, saw it all happen right in front of his post. Time slowed down for James Wilson. He saw Walter falling toward the stone path. The old man's arms waved helplessly in the air. His cane was already on the ground. In less than a second, Walter's head would hit the hard stone. James knew the rules. Never leave your post. Never break formation. The rules were clear and strict. Guards who broke them lost their jobs. But James also knew what would happen if Walter hit his head. At his age, such a fall could cause brain damage or even death. James had seen enough injuries in his time as a soldier to know how fragile human life could be. In that split second, James made his choice. Rules were important, but a human life was worth more than any rule. Without hesitation, James stepped forward from his post. His movement was so sudden that the other guards looked at him in shock. Captain Harris, who was walking behind the line, froze with his mouth open. The crowd gasped as the palace guard, who was supposed to stand still no matter what, broke formation and rushed forward. James moved with the speed and grace of a trained soldier. His arms stretched out toward Walter. Just inches before the old man's head would have hit the stone, James caught him. The crowd went silent, then erupted in cheers. James held Walter steady, making sure the old man had his balance before letting go. Then James picked up Walter's cane and handed it to him. "Thank you, son," Walter said, his voice shaking. "You saved my life." James nodded but didn't smile. He was still on duty, even if he had broken the rules. He looked back at his post, knowing he would face punishment for what he had done. Captain Harris's face was red with anger. In 20 years as head guard, he had never seen such a breach of protocol. He started walking toward James with stern steps. Meanwhile, the crowd's attention turned to Derek. People who had seen him push Walter pointed at him. Angry voices rose from all sides. He pushed the old man. "Get him. Call the police." Derek looked around, suddenly realizing he was in trouble. The happy tourists had turned into an angry mob pointing at him. He tried to back away, but there was nowhere to go. Two police officers who had been standing nearby pushed through the crowd. They had not seen the push, but they could tell from the crowd's reaction that something bad had happened. "What's going on here?" one officer asked. Multiple people spoke at once, all pointing at Derek. The officers looked at him with suspicion. Derek tried to look innocent. "It was an accident," he said. The old man lost his balance. "I didn't do anything." But too many people had seen what really happened. A woman stepped forward, holding up her phone. "I have it on video," she said. "He pushed the old man on purpose." The officers looked at the video, then at Derek. One of them took out handcuffs. "Sir, you're under arrest for assault," the officer said, reaching for Derek's arm. Derek panicked. He wasn't going back to jail. He had already spent 2 years behind bars for fighting, and he had promised himself never to go back. Without thinking, Derek pushed one of the officers and tried to run. He didn't get far. The second officer caught him quickly. Together, the two officers forced Derek to the ground and handcuffed him. "Adding assault on a police officer to your charges," one officer told him as they lifted Derek to his feet. "Not a smart move." As the police led Derek away, the ceremony around them had stopped. The royal band had gone silent. All eyes were on the scene by the palace gates. The arrested thug, the saved old man, and the guard who had broken all rules to save a life. Walter stood shaking, supported by kind tourists who had come to help him. The shock of what had happened was setting in, making his legs weak. James Wilson still stood near Walter, not sure what to do next. Should he return to his post? Was he even still a palace guard after breaking such an important rule? Captain Harris reached James and Walter. His face was hard to read now. The anger had changed to something else. Confusion, maybe, or surprise. "Guard Wilson," Captain Harris said in a stern voice. "You left your post during the royal ceremony." James stood straight and nodded. "Yes, sir. I did." What happened next would surprise everyone at the palace gates that day. Captain Harris looked at James, then at Walter. The old guard captain had never faced this kind of situation before. The rules were clear. Leaving your post meant automatic dismissal from the palace guards. But the circumstances were unusual. "The ceremony is disrupted anyway," Captain Harris said finally. "Take 5 minutes to make sure this gentleman is all right, then return to your position." James was surprised. He had expected to be ordered off duty immediately. "Yes, sir," he replied, standing at attention. As Captain Harris walked away, he spoke quietly to another guard. The guard nodded and hurried inside the palace. "Are you hurt, sir?" James asked Walter, speaking for the first time since the incident. His voice was deep and kind. Walter shook his head. "Thanks to you, young man. I'm not hurt at all. Just a bit shaken." The old teacher looked at James with grateful eyes. "You broke the rules to save me." James helped Walter to a bench near the gates. A palace medic came over to check Walter's condition. James stood nearby, still in his full guard uniform, looking out of place away from his post. Tourists gathered around, taking pictures of James and Walter. Some clapped when they looked at James. Others came to shake his hand, but James politely kept his distance. He was still on duty, and touching the palace guards was not allowed. The police had taken Derek away. He would face serious charges for assaulting an elderly person and resisting arrest. His day of anger had turned into a future of legal problems. While the medic checked Walter, a royal aide, a woman in a neat black suit, came out from the palace. She spoke briefly to Captain Harris, then walked over to where James and Walter sat. "His Royal Highness, the Prince, has been informed of the incident," she announced. He has asked to meet both of you." Walter's eyes grew wide. "The prince wants to meet me." James looked equally surprised. "Now, ma'am." The aide nodded. "Right now." The prince was watching the ceremony and saw everything from the palace window. "He has postponed his next meeting to speak with you both." This was very unusual. Royal family members rarely met with tourists, especially not on such short notice. Something about this incident had caught the prince's attention. Walter tried to stand but found his legs were still weak from shock. James gently helped him up. The old man leaned on his cane and on James's strong arm. "I never thought I would meet royalty," Walter said, his voice full of wonder. "And in my travel clothes, too." James smiled slightly. "I never thought I would break formation and still be a palace guard 5 minutes later." The royal aide led them through a side gate, away from the public areas. Palace staff looked curiously at the strange pair. A palace guard in full uniform walking beside an elderly tourist, both following a royal aide. As they entered the palace, Walter gasped at the beauty around him. Golden decorations covered the walls. Paintings by famous artists hung everywhere. Crystal chandeliers sparkled above their heads. "I taught my students about this place for 40 years, Walter said. "I described these halls so many times from pictures and books. But seeing it in person," his voice broke with emotion. James had been inside the palace many times for guard duty, but he still appreciated its beauty. "It's something special," he agreed. They were led to a small meeting room where the prince waited. He was younger than Walter had expected, perhaps in his 40s, dressed in a simple but expensive suit. "Please, sit down," the prince said, motioning to chairs across from him. His voice was warm and friendly. Walter sat carefully, still feeling shaky. James remained standing until the prince specifically asked him to sit. "I saw what happened from my window," the prince began. "Guard Wilson, you broke protocol to save this gentleman's life." James sat straight in his chair. "Yes, Your Highness." The prince looked at him thoughtfully. "The palace guard rules were written hundreds of years ago. They say guards must never leave their posts during ceremonies, unless there is a threat to the royal family or the palace itself." James nodded. He knew the rules well. "But," the prince continued, "I believe the spirit of those rules is to protect people. And today, that's exactly what you did." Walter spoke up, his voice stronger now. "Your Highness, if this young man hadn't moved when he did, I would have hit my head on the stone. At my age, that could have been fatal." The prince nodded. "I know. That's why I wanted to meet you both." He turned to James. "Guard Wilson, instead of punishment, I believe you deserve recognition for your actions today." The prince's words hung in the air. James sat very still, not sure he had heard correctly. Recognition instead of punishment. That was not what he had expected at all. "Thank you, Your Highness," James said finally. "But I was just doing what seemed right." The prince smiled. "And that's exactly why you deserve recognition. Rules are important, but judgment is more important. You showed excellent judgment today." Walter nodded in agreement. "He saved my life, Your Highness. I don't know many young people these days who would risk their job for an old man they don't even know." The prince looked thoughtful. "Guard Wilson, tell me about yourself. How long have you been with the palace guards?" 3 years, Your Highness," James answered. "Before that, I was in the army for 4 years." "I thought so," the prince said. "You move like someone with military training. Were you in combat?" James nodded. "Yes, Your Highness. 2 tours." The prince seemed impressed. He turned to Walter. "And you, sir? What brings you to our palace today?" Walter sat up straighter, his hands folded over his cane. "I'm Walter Jenkins, Your Highness. I was a history teacher for 40 years before I retired. I taught thousands of students about this palace, using only pictures in books. This is my first time seeing it in person." The prince's face softened. 40 years teaching about a place you had never visited. "That's dedication, Mr. Jenkins." Walter smiled. Teaching was my life, Your Highness, and this palace is an important part of our country's history. The prince turned back to James. What you did today matters, Guard Wilson. It shows what our palace guards truly stand for: protection and service, not just following rules blindly. A secretary entered the room and whispered something to the prince. He nodded and stood up. I must attend another meeting now, the prince said. But this is what will happen. Mr. Jenkins, we will arrange a private tour of the palace for you tomorrow, if you're feeling well enough. You'll see areas most tourists never get to visit. Walter's face lit up with joy. That would be wonderful, Your Highness. Thank you. The prince turned to James. As for you, Guard Wilson, return to your duties today. Tomorrow, report to Captain Harris for a special assignment. I'll be speaking with him about changing some of our protocols to allow guards to help in emergencies without breaking rules. James stood and saluted. Yes, Your Highness. Thank you. As they left the meeting room, Walter could hardly believe what had happened. From nearly hitting my head on the pavement to meeting the prince. What a day, he said shakily. James smiled. It's been unusual for me too, Mr. Jenkins. The royal aide who had brought them in now came to show them out. As they walked, Walter had a question. Why did you do it? He asked James. You could have lost your job. The other guards didn't move. James was quiet for a moment. My grandmother raised me, he said finally. She always told me that rules matter, but people matter more. When I saw you falling, I just thought of what she would want me to do. Walter nodded, understanding. Your grandmother raised you right, young man. They reached the side gate where they had entered. The royal aide informed Walter that a palace car would pick him up at his hotel tomorrow for the special tour. Walter could hardly contain his excitement. James prepared to return to his post, but Walter stopped him with a hand on his arm. I don't know how to thank you properly, the old teacher said, his eyes misty. You didn't just save me from injury. You made an old man's dream come true. Without you, I would never have met the prince or gotten a special tour. James smiled. Just enjoy your tour tomorrow, Mr. Jenkins. That's thanks enough. As James walked back to his post, palace staff looked at him with new respect. Word had spread quickly about what had happened. The guard who had broken the rules to save an old man, and had been personally recognized by the prince for it, was becoming something of a palace legend already. Captain Harris was waiting at the guard post. His face was no longer angry, but it wasn't exactly friendly either. The prince called me, Captain Harris said. You're to continue your duties today and report to me tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock sharp. Yes, sir, James replied, resuming his position. As the ceremony restarted, James stood at attention, facing forward as the rules required. But something had changed. The tourists looking at him now saw not just a man in a fancy uniform, but a hero who had proven that behind the strict rules and serious faces, the palace guards were still human, and some of them, at least, were heroes. The next morning, the story was everywhere. Palais Garde Biarriques, Ruelis, to Ace Ave Elder Loy Tourist, read the headlines. Pictures of James catching Walter filled the front pages of newspapers and websites. Video of the incident had gone viral online, with millions of views overnight. James arrived at the palace at 7:45 a.m., 15 minutes before his meeting with Captain Harris. He wore his full uniform, perfectly pressed and polished. As he walked through the staff entrance, other guards and palace workers stopped to look at him. Some nodded with respect. Others seemed unsure how to react to a guard who had broken the rules and been praised for it. At exactly 8 o'clock, James knocked on Captain Harris's office door. Enter, called the captain's voice. James walked in and stood at attention. Captain Harris was sitting behind his desk, reading a newspaper with James's picture on the front page. Guard Wilson, Captain Harris said, not looking up. You've become quite famous overnight. Not by choice, sir, James replied. Captain Harris put down the newspaper and looked at James directly. I've been head of palace guards for 20 years, Wilson. In that time, I fired 6 guards for breaking formation. Rules exist for a reason. James stayed silent, waiting for whatever punishment might still come. However, Captain Harris continued, the prince has taken a personal interest in your case. He believes your actions showed the kind of judgment and humanity that the palace should encourage. The captain stood up and walked to a window overlooking the palace grounds. I spoke with the prince for over an hour yesterday. We've decided to create a new protocol for emergency situations. Guards will now be permitted to assist tourists in cases of immediate danger to life. James was surprised. A change in protocols that had existed for centuries, because of what he had done. The prince also has a special assignment for you, Captain Harris said, turning back to James. Starting next week, you will divide your duties. 3 days as regular palace guard, 2 days training new guards in the updated protocols and emergency response. Training, sir? James asked. Yes, the prince thinks your military background and your judgment make you the right person to teach others when rules can be bent for the right reasons. James stood straighter. I'm honored, sir. Captain Harris almost smiled. Almost. Don't let it go to your head, Wilson. You're still breaking hundreds of years of tradition. Yes, sir, James replied. Now there's another matter, Captain Harris said, sitting back down. The press wants interviews. The palace usually doesn't allow guards to speak to reporters, but in this case, the prince thinks it might be good for the public to hear from you directly. 1 interview only, with a reporter the palace will choose. James nodded. Speaking to reporters had not been part of his plan when he joined the palace guards, but nothing about the past day had been part of his plan. And one more thing, Captain Harris added. Mr. Jenkins, the gentleman you helped, will be here in 1 hour for his special tour. The prince has asked if you would be his guide. This surprised James most of all. Me, sir. But I'm not a tour guide. You know the palace well enough, Captain Harris replied. And the prince thinks Mr. Jenkins would prefer to have you show him around. Consider it part of your new duties. At 9:30, Walter Jenkins arrived at the palace in a royal car. He looked much better than the day before. He wore a neat suit and carried his cane more for support than necessity. His face lit up when he saw James waiting at the entrance. Guard Wilson, Walter called happily. Or may I call you James now that you're my tour guide? James smiled. James is fine, Mr. Jenkins. Then I'm Walter to you, the old teacher replied. No need for formality between us after what happened yesterday. James led Walter into the palace through areas usually closed to tourists. He showed him the grand hall where royal celebrations were held, the historic library with books hundreds of years old, and the portrait gallery of past kings and queens. Walter was like a child in a candy store. He knew the history of each room, each painting, each piece of furniture. When they reached the throne room, Walter's eyes filled with tears. I described this room to students for 40 years, he said softly. I showed them pictures and told them stories. But being here, he couldn't finish his sentence. The interview ended soon after. The journalist thanked James and told him off camera, "You're a natural. The public is going to love you even more after this airs." James wasn't sure how he felt about being loved by the public. He had joined the palace guards partly because the job usually kept him out of the spotlight. Now he was suddenly famous. That evening, James received a phone call from Walter. The old teacher had watched the interview live on television. "You did wonderfully, my boy," Walter said. "Humble and honest, just as I would expect." "Thank you, Walter," James replied. "How are things in your town?" Walter chuckled. "I've become quite popular. My former students keep visiting. The local school has asked me to give a talk about my palace adventure. Me giving a talk about history I actually lived through." James smiled. "You'll be a wonderful speaker. You have a gift for telling stories." "Speaking of stories," Walter said, his tone becoming more serious, "I've been thinking about writing a book about what happened. About rules and when to break them. about how a single moment of courage can change many lives. Would you mind if I included your story? I would be honored, James said, but only if you include your story too. Your life as a teacher is just as important as anything I did. After they hung up, James stood by his window, looking out at the palace grounds in the evening light. A week ago, he had been just another guard, standing still and following rules. Now he was helping change those rules, training other guards, appearing on television, and becoming part of a book. All because he had made one decision in a split second. As James prepared for bed, his phone beeped with a message. It was from Captain Harris, which was unusual. The captain rarely sent personal messages to guards. The message contained a link to a news article and only 3 words: "You were right." James clicked the link. The article described how another palace guard, in a different city, had broken protocol to help a child who had wandered into a dangerous area during a ceremony. The guard had cited James's example as inspiration. James smiled and put down his phone. One small act of courage was spreading, creating more acts of courage. Perhaps that was the greatest reward of all. 3 months passed. Summer turned to fall, and the trees around the palace showed red and gold leaves. The story of James and Walter had faded from the headlines, replaced by other news, but its effects continued to spread. The new palace guard protocols had been officially named the Wilson Protocol in James's honor. Guards across the country were now trained to help people in danger, even during ceremonies. Several lives had already been saved as a result. James continued his dual role: 3 days as a regular guard, 2 days training others. He had grown comfortable speaking to groups and sharing his experience. The other guards, even the older ones, now respected him. Captain Harris had changed too. The strict old captain still believed in rules, but he had learned to see their purpose differently. He now told new guards, rules exist to protect people. Never forget that people come first. Derek Smith, the man who pushed Walter, served his time in prison. During his sentence, he wrote a letter of apology to Walter. The letter showed genuine regret. "I am sorry for what I did to you. My anger has cost me everything. I am taking classes to learn to control my temper. I hope someday to be a better person, the kind who helps others instead of hurting them." Walter sent a short reply: "Apology accepted. It's never too late to change your path." Walter's life had changed dramatically. His story had inspired many people, especially teachers and students. He received hundreds of letters from people touched by his experience. A publisher had offered him a contract to write a book about his life as a teacher and his palace adventure. Walter worked on his book every day, sitting at his old desk where he had graded thousands of student papers over the years. He called James weekly to ask questions and share his progress. "The book is coming along well," Walter told James during one call. "But I need to see you again to get some details right. Would you be able to visit my town next month? I know it's a long trip." "I'd be happy to," James replied. He had 2 weeks of vacation coming, and he had been wondering how to spend them. A month later, James arrived in Walter's small town. It was very different from the busy city where the palace stood. Here, everyone knew each other. Main Street had small shops instead of tall buildings. The pace of life was slower, more peaceful. Walter welcomed James with a warm hug. The old teacher looked healthier and happier than when James had last seen him. Writing the book had given him new energy and purpose. Come in, Walter said, leading James into his home. It was a small house filled with books, photos, and memories of a long teaching career. Pictures of Walter with different classes of students covered one wall, showing 40 years of changing faces and fashions. "I want you to meet some people," Walter said. "I hope you don't mind, but I've arranged a small gathering at the local high school tomorrow. Some of my former students want to meet you." James was surprised. "Meet me? Why?" Walter smiled. "Because you're part of their teacher's story now, and because what you did matters to them." The next day, James and Walter went to the high school. James expected a small gathering of maybe 10 or 20 people. Instead, the school gymnasium was full. Hundreds of people of all ages waited to meet them. An older woman approached them first. "Mr. Jenkins was my history teacher in 1975, she told James. "He made me love history so much that I became a teacher too. I've taught for 30 years because of him." One by one, Walter's former students came forward. Some were now teachers themselves. Others were doctors, engineers, business owners, parents, grandparents. All had been shaped in some way by Walter's teaching. A young guard from the local government building approached James. "What you did at the palace inspired me," he told James. "Last month, I broke protocol to help a woman who collapsed during a ceremony. My supervisors praised me instead of punishing me because of the Wilson Protocol." James was amazed. His one action had spread so far, touching lives in places he had never been. That evening, Walter showed James the nearly finished manuscript of his book. The title page read, "Rules and Hearts, A Teacher's Unexpected Journey." Below it was a dedication to James Wilson, who taught us all that courage means doing the right thing, even when rules say otherwise. James felt tears in his eyes as he read it. "I don't know what to say, Walter. This is too much honor for what I did." Walter shook his head. "It's exactly the right amount of honor. You didn't just save me from a fall, James. You sparked a change that has already saved other lives. And your example has taught people something important about rules and humanity." On James's last day in town, Walter took him to the local park. They sat on a bench under a large oak tree, watching children play nearby. "I have something to tell you," Walter said. "The doctors have found something. Cancer. It's advanced." James felt his heart sink. "Walter, I'm so sorry. Can they treat it?" Walter shook his head. "They could try, but at my age, I've decided to focus on finishing my book instead. I want to complete it while I still can." James didn't know what to say. In just a few months, this man had become like family to him. "Don't look so sad," Walter said, patting James's hand. "I've had a good life. 40 years teaching students I loved, a wonderful marriage to marry. And now this adventure with you and the book. Many people don't get half so much." They sat quietly for a while, watching the children's game. "Life is like those children playing," Walter said finally. "We follow the rules of the game, but sometimes the most important moments come when someone has the courage to step outside the rules for the right reason." James nodded, understanding. "Like when you let students turn in papers late if they were really trying." Walter looked surprised. "How did you know about that?" "Some of your students told me yesterday. They said you were strict about most rules, but you always made exceptions when someone was sincere and trying their best." Walter smiled. "Teaching taught me when rules matter and when hearts matter more. It seems you learned the same lesson as a soldier in guard." As they walked back to Walter's house, the old teacher moved slowly, leaning on both James and his cane. But his voice was strong as he said, "Promise me something, James. Promise me you'll keep teaching others what you've learned. About rules and hearts. About courage and kindness." "I promise," James said, and he meant it. 6 months later, Walter's book was published. It became a bestseller, touching readers around the world with its simple but powerful message about rules, courage, and doing the right thing. Walter lived just long enough to hold the finished book in his hands. He died peacefully at home, surrounded by photos of his students and the palace he had loved. At Walter's funeral, James stood in his palace guard uniform, honoring the teacher who had become his friend. Hundreds of Walter's former students attended, each carrying a copy of his book. After the funeral, James returned to his duties at the palace, but something had changed inside him. He now understood that his true duty went beyond guarding a building or following protocols. Like Walter, his real purpose was to teach others through his example. Each day, as tourists gathered at the palace gates, many recognized James from the book or news stories. Children especially would point and whisper, "That's the guard who saved the teacher." James would stand straight and serious, as palace guards should. But sometimes, if a child waved or an elderly person looked tired, he would break the rules just a little, with a small nod, a hint of a smile, or a helping hand. Because he had learned what Walter had taught for 40 years. Rules matter, but people matter more. And that lesson, like the ripples from a stone thrown in water, continues to spread outward, touching more lives with each passing day.